G'day and welcome to another episode of Perth Property Insider. I'm your host, Jared Mann, and today I'm excited to have my colleague, Jewayne Loong, Property Manager Extraordinaire, REWA Property Manager of the Year from 2013, and really knowledgeable on the Residential Tenancy Act. And what better person to talk to about the changes that are proposed for the Residential Tenancy Act than Jewayne. So we're going to deep dive into what these proposed changes mean to the average investor, our opinion and take on the impact that they're likely to have, how does it compare to our existing act, and what are some of the implications that might come about as a result. So lots to cover today. Let's go inside.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management specialists servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here is your host, Jared Mann.
G'day, Jewayne. Thanks for joining me again. It's been a while since we've had you on, and it wasn't because your ratings sucked. It's because we haven't been back on property management as a topic. But today we've got a really juicy one in store. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me again, Jared. Thank you.
So we've made it to 52 episodes in 52 weeks. I'm surprised at how many topics I've managed to come up with. And just wanted to thank all the listeners for tuning in so far and all the guests for making things a bit more interesting than just hearing me ramble on. So really excited to be at this milestone, and thank you all listeners. I've got the proposed changes to the Residential Tenancies Act in front of us, and I thought it would be really worthwhile us spending some time to break these down and go through what sort of impact they might have for the average landlord, and also look at what it might mean for tenants a bit along the way too. And you might have seen that some of the other states around Australia are also updating the Residential Tenancies Act if you've got properties in those states. And so WA is not alone, and I think there's going to be more of a trend towards adopting similar things across the board. So don't be surprised if you see some of these ideas popping up in the other states that haven't had their reviews yet. And overall, you probably don't need to guess, but it's moving more in favour of the tenant as a protected species. And it's going to make the management of your property to be harder, especially if you're going to try to go about self-managing. And if you've got a property manager, it's really a case of them getting up to speed and adopting, the changes and working out how to practically administer them. So I should mention that these are just proposed changes at this point. And the good news is that you're still able to have your say. REWA's got a survey open for landlords, and they're gathering feedback to pass on to Parliament at this point in time. So it's a really good time to get your head around them, get your own thoughts about them, and pop through some feedback on that survey. So I hope we don't lose any listeners here falling asleep. Jewayne, you'll have to try to make things exciting.
I'll do my best.
And this is a topic that I thought was important, but it sometimes can be quite technical, and there can be, a lot of specifics. So I'm going to go quite high level in the discussion, and we'll go through some of the most important changes that are going to be meaningful. By no means won't be all the proposed changes or changes that they'll adopt. If that makes sense. So first one is they're looking at changing the law about how they keep pets in rental properties. And in essence, they're proposing to allow all tenants to be able to keep pets. What does that sound like to you? So if tenants are actually allowed to keep pets, what sort of conditions should apply? Well, that's still up in the air. And what might be reasonable grounds for an owner to refuse the keeping of pets? That's still to be decided. And some of the possible options on the table is that only allowing a landlord to refuse where there's reasonable grounds to do so. and allowing a landlord to refuse if there's an exemption from the court or commissioner. So how would you feel about tenants keeping pets in your property, Jewayne, and not having a choice about it? I imagine some of the exemptions might be if you've got credible hay fever or some kind of medical condition, you might be able to be exempt from that. Not sure what other conditions might allow you to not have your tenant keep a pet. But what's your thoughts?
Well, I think that differs quite dramatically to what we've got now, where we can kind of say yes or no to pets. And by changing that, I think what it will do is that at the moment, a lot of landlords are saying pets considered and taking pets as part of that reference checking process to make sure that those pets won't do damages to the property. By making a change like this, I think it just allows people to be able to move their families around a little bit easier, because let's face it, you've got a dog, I've got a dog, and I wouldn't be moving into any rental anytime soon if they said I had to ditch the dog.
Exactly.
So I think it's a fair move given how many people are starting to have pets as part of their family. But I think the little bits of detail around what can be considered an exemption really needs to be refined to make it fair for both parties as well.
Of course, there'll be certain strata groups where a bylaw may prevent a pet and they wouldn't be able to have a pet in those circumstances, I imagine. And look, personally, I've always allowed tenants of my properties to keep pets because it helps them feel that that they're more at home, and gives them one less reason to move if they are looking at adding an additional pet. And I've always encouraged our clients to allow pets, especially where their circumstances suit. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what sort of exemptions are possible, won't it? My only concern was, and having thought about this for a while, the pet bond at the moment that we're allowed to take is $260. And that's towards fumigation and treatment only of carpets and stuff. So nowhere is it proposed, or are we able to take any more than a 4-week bond. So a landlord at the moment is not really compensated for the extra risk of allowing a pet in a property. And if a pet does damage something, it can run a hell of a lot more in cost and can really add up. So I would have liked them to have allowed an extra week or two rent in the bond to allow for that extra risk. But of course, we're not seeing any mention of that in the proposal, are we?
Not at this point.
And not ever, probably.
Yeah.
So pets, look, I think all in all, that's an understandable one, and it could, help tenants transition between homes. And, it might mean that owners need to consider how their properties are set up for the keeping of pets and make them more pet friendly and more accommodating. So that could be one to think of, especially if the legislation is passed to include it. So next one is, should a landlord give certain information to a tenant before a tenancy agreement is signed? Now, I thought this one was only a good one because it is going to clear up, some of the grey area that can arise when a tenant is taking on a property. So some of the areas they're looking at is, requiring a landlord to tell an applicant if certain things about the property, such as their intent, does the owner have an intention to sell over that next 12 months, or whether it contains asbestos, or whether there's other things that should be disclosed. Now, I would have thought that real estate agents are already bound under their code of conduct to disclose anything that is of a material fact that would have bearing on someone's perception of value, or whether or not they'll take the lease on the property or make an application for it. So where this kind of comes into play is that many times a landlord can be thinking about selling or have a very definite plan to sell, but they don't necessarily tell the agent, and there's probably no need to tell the tenant if it is some ways off or if it's not firm. So it's really going to come down to, how concrete does this plan need to be to have to tell the tenant that they're thinking of selling. And I would have thought a lot of the other things that are needed for disclosure should already be getting disclosed to the tenant, Jewayne. So do you have any thoughts on this part?
Yeah, I think, again, it's very vague in what they've proposed in terms of the finer detail of it. But I think that as a tenant moving into a property, you do want to know if the owner wants to put the property on market within the next month, because your weekends will be taken up by viewings and home opens,
sure.
and it's not part of the deal that you otherwise had agreed to, right? So there are certain things that I think do need to be disclosed, but how, as an agent, we've seen it before where our clients may have not had the intention to sell when we renewed the lease or we drew a lease up, but circumstances change, and within a few months it needs to go on market. Needless to say, the tenant's upset and a bit frustrated and feels almost sometimes maybe deceived. But in a lot of those cases, it's a genuine need. Something has happened, and this is why I think there has to be some level of disclosure if we know, so we're not moving towards an agreement with something that's a material fact being hidden. But I think it might be a good one too, as long as we've got, again, the exact detail of what disclosures are required, rather than saying in the grey material fact, because the material fact is different to everyone.
So one of the other areas they're talking about with this is potentially having a public database of landlords that are proven not to comply with tenancy laws and make that available for tenants to search. So it'd basically be a blacklisting of landlords database maintained by the Department of Mines. And that would almost be like the National Tenancy Database for tenants. So did you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, look, I think what that will do is a lot of the investors that are good investors, the clients that we're working with, the people that are prepared to spend money and follow the legislation, that there's no harm for those types of people. But the guys that are doing the dodge and renting out properties that are not up to standard, up to code, they're the ones that will obviously feel the biggest impact for having a database like this. But I actually think that's not a bad idea either, because it brings up the standard of living for all of those tenants and brings that property up to a standard that people expect to live in. If you're paying good money for a property, you want a good property. So I think, again, it has to be refined a little bit more, Jared, but I think it's not a bad concept. Just it's not a bad concept.
I mean, at the moment, we assume that everyone does the right thing just because we do. And and it's certainly not the case, because we know in taking on many new managements each month, just some of the shocking practices that owners are facing when they eventually decide to leave their property manager. So I can only imagine how that experience is on the tenant side, and I can't imagine for private landlords out there that when they go to finally appoint a manager, they don't even know what they're doing wrong necessarily. So it can be a slippery slope. And if there's a place where tenants can actually find out ahead of time, is this landlord that I'm renting from, have they had some black marks against their name, they might think twice about taking that tenancy, wouldn't they?
Yeah, definitely. Almost 100% in fact. So
it's a warning sign if they're willing to take on the tenancy when there is black marks. So warning sign against the tenant.
Yeah, that's right.
So another one here, which is a no-brainer, and I won't spend too much time talking about this, but this is just talking about making sure, educating landlords on the best practices around information, storage and privacy. And I thought that was an absolute no-brainer because, we're already governed by the Privacy Act here as real estate agents, but a lot of these things that we, do, such as not giving out personal information and protecting the privacy of our applicants, our owners and our tenants, it's not a given when it comes to private landlords. So they might be in for a bit of a shock/education for all the self-managing people out there. And I didn't see any major issue with that. Just again, making, things harder for that self-manager. And nothing really different for anyone that uses a property manager. So this one, this has a lot of potential to really be contentious. So should we encourage landlords to offer tenants longer leases? And they're looking at maybe 5-year leases or maybe leases without any end date. So I can understand where they're coming from, that tenants want their certainty, and that it can be very difficult when you've got kids and you're having to move and you're trying to get them in the same school zones and various, you just want stability for your family. So I understand where they're coming from, the department, with proposing this. And I'm sure all the tenancy advocates have all been very much behind it. Mm-hmm. But what it may mean is having leases just go on for an indefinitely long period, except for where there's special terms or conditions perhaps in them, and limiting the use of fixed term tenancies so that it remains open-ended and people can only end for certain reasons. So
yeah, I think this is a really interesting one because it's almost a bit of a reframe of property managers and investors' mindset, because at the moment there's, a particular process we need to follow with the Residential Tenancy Act. And that's why a lot of clients say 1 year, that's enough. If they're good, we'll renew. If not, we'll get them out because it's the easiest option to ask a tenant to move on if they haven't been the greatest. But I think it's a bit of a reframe because, if you can have a good tenant in there, you don't want to have to renew every year, go through that whole process every year. If you've got a good tenant that's in there, chuck in a rent review clause in there, as well as, some special conditions. But I think it comes down to how do we end that agreement? And I think that's probably the uncertain thing for myself. How do we end these agreements?
Well, they do touch on some other proposed changes later, so we'll get to those in a minute. It basically would mean that, the way I understand it anyway, is that if we're just on ongoing periodic agreements, as in there's no fixed term, it's just open-ended, or if the tenancy agreement is for much longer, then there might be changes to how the notice periods and how the actual tenancy's ended. So we'll touch on some of those in a minute. But some of the things that I thought about was how would rental increases be handled, and can they still just be done? And at the moment, I actually like the beauty of how rent reviews are handled, because we do a 6-month rent review, which the tenant, in most cases may not have. They're already in the lease, and the rent review is agreed upon prior to going into that lease. So it gets carried out. And if the rent has gone up in the meantime, that increase is passed on to the tenant in line with market. And there's many different ways you can do your 6-month rent review. That's how we do them. So at the end of that tenancy, if the market rent is higher than the tenant wants to pay, that's their kind of chance to exit and their way out. So I didn't know if that same time for exiting would be allowed. And I guess it just comes down to that notice period. Maybe they could give their 3 months notice or their 4-month notice if the rent was getting beyond their means, and that could be their option of exiting. So yeah, a lot of uncertainty around then how rent reviews would tie into it for me.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
So the other aspect that a lot of people might not appreciate is that when we've got this 6 or 12-month lease, and they're usually 12-month leases, because we only usually start a tenant on 6 months if they've requested it, or if we're not that sure of the applicant when we're commencing the tenancy. And that would be the case most of the time, wouldn't it, Jewayne?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So one of the things that does come up is that very often the tenant may not be an ideal tenant. And I'm going to try to put this in the easiest way possible. So no one thing might be terribly bad or breachable. They might not, let's say they're not keeping the property well. Let's say they're not paying their rent sometimes, but then they catch up. But it stresses the owner out to have uncertainty of their funds and when they're getting paid as well. So, and maybe they could be very difficult to deal with, and you don't find this out until you get into the tenancy, and sometimes until it's all too late for all parties. So none of these things individually might be enough to breach or terminate a tenant. And at the moment, we've only got a lease for a year. So we all kind of know when we get around to the end of this year that if the owner wants to change over their tenant, they can not renew the lease, and we can go about finding our other tenant. And none of these things might be big enough to breach, but it's enough for someone not to want to continue. Now, the challenge with these longer leases, or with potentially one of the other changes proposed later, is not you have to have a reason for ending a lease, and that those reasons only certain ones might be allowed, such as selling or owner moving back in. But if there's this middle ground of tenant not quite ideal on many fronts, but nothing's enough to be breachable, then basically we could be stuck with that tenant as a landlord and not have a soft way of going our separate ways. So do you see that as potentially a problem, Jewayne?
Yeah, I certainly do. That's what I was alluding to a little bit earlier. I know a few of our clients have actually requested that with any lease, they start with a tenant. 6 months is the maximum they're prepared to give to a tenant because they feel like that's their only way to exercise their rights and ask a tenant to leave on no grounds. So as you mentioned, a tenant that's not quite there, that's just a nice, simple way for the client to say, look, move on, you go your separate way. We'll find somebody else who's a better fit for us.
Yeah, and soft exit.
Yeah, and the reason a lot of landlords, I guess, have come to me and had this conversation is because they've been burnt in the past by previous tenancies, previous managers, self-managing, and just going through that process of being burnt and realizing that I don't want to be signed up to a tenant for 24 months off the bat with a little bit of uncertainty. Happy to renew a long-term tenant if we know they're good, but we don't know till we start working with them. So that's the problem that I foresee moving forward is if we're not getting along the way we should be, how do we end that?
And there's no grounds to actually, terminate the tenancy, and
that's right.
Then it could be difficult. So
that's right.
All right. Well, let's go on to the next one. And I hope landlords who are listening haven't hung up their boots and decided to get out of owning an investment property yet. But look, all these things are manageable. And as I say, but many of them are going to be coming into other states as well. And by understanding them, we can then, all get on the same page and work out how to make the best of them too. So next one, rent increases. Should there be a change to how often rent can be increased, and should the rent increases be capped? Jesus, Jewayne, talking about capping rental increases in selected zones across Perth potentially. I think that would be a bloody nightmare. Sorry to jump right in.
Well, it just depends on what the cap is.
It does depend what the cap is. And getting that right, I just think any cap's a bad idea, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it holds back that free movement of the market. Supply and demand is there for a reason. And yeah, if you're putting a cap on it, then it's just limiting and putting pressure on other places. It happens. You see it all the time.
It's a distortion, isn't it? And
100%.
It imposes abnormal impacts on those markets. And imagine if that then affects an investor's decision whether to own a property there or not. And maybe it would have impact on, sale prices, knowing that rent can't be increased by as much, or, you're limited. So I'd really hope they get this, if they're going to have a cap, that it's right. If it was 20% or 30% in a year, then we can work with that.
Well, that's basically what's happened in our market in the past 12 months, right? 20, 25%. And, I think that the market has moved very, very quickly, and some tenants are finding it hard. And I completely understand that. I feel sorry for a lot of tenants when they're unable to find a property and they can't afford to pay for what they're used to. But as an investor too, we have to ride the ups and downs when we can, because when the market drops out 20%, 30%, and we're sitting at the bottom end of the market, I don't see there to be a rent, decrease clause where it might cap
rental decrease cap. Can we have the cap the other way, Jewayne? The 30,
yes,
3% that happened over 3 years. Well, I'd love it.
Yes.
We'll put the negative cap at 5%. I didn't see that in the proposed changes anywhere.
Yeah, and look, we've all been through that. We've seen it go up and down, and it's sort of the time now where investors can make some of that loss back if they've purchased slightly the wrong time and the market's moved away from them. Then there has to be you can't do this and put a 5% increase and expect the market to continue the way it has been going for the past however many years.
Another part to this was looking at changing things so that you might not be able to review rents every 6 months. You might be limited to only increasing them every 12 months. So I personally wasn't that excited about that, because at the moment we're able to, review at 6 months and pass on some of that increase that the market's had. And it's not as big a shock to the tenant then when we rock up at 12 months and pass on a whole increase. There's been a more modest increase in the meantime. So there's kind of pros and cons to that. I can see that a tenant on one hand might like certainty of what they're paying for that whole 12 months. and that for them, getting an increase in 6 months that they can't exactly plan for can be difficult. So yeah, I see both sides, but I think we should be able to increase every 6 months. And again, this is another control that they're imposing. So next one, maintenance and handling of repairs. So how do we ensure that landlords do repairs and maintenance to their property? Now, I wasn't too worried about this one because the idea of what they're proposing here is a maintenance bond. So having an amount held perhaps with the external department such that if maintenance that's required on the property and is necessary is not done, then the tenant could apply to have it taken out of this maintenance bond that's held. And look, I can understand that there might be those owners that put their head in the sand out there. I can say for certain that the vast majority of our clients, are extremely good with maintenance and address it as it comes up. And if it's a larger item that isn't required, we can put a plan and work a plan with the tenant on doing it, as long as it's not an essential service or something that was non-negotiable in the property. So I think the idea that every investor has to come up with extra money to put in a maintenance bond for the government to earn interest on the funds that are just held there and not used, well, I'm sure this is where they're eyeing up their next money pool to create funds, the interest they'll use towards the first homeowners grant and other things. So I think it's overkill personally, but I can also understand for those tenants that are struggling to get maintenance done why it might be seen as necessary. Any ideas around that one?
The biggest thing for me is what's considered repair and maintenance, and what's the threshold before a tenant needs to apply to the bond admin to be able to have that release of funds for things to be done. If it is urgent emergency repairs, I actually don't mind that. I think that's pretty fair. But if it's a loose door handle or something that's quite silly,
it's certainly opening the door to a whole bunch of extra administration of, what constitutes a acceptable withdrawal then. So
yeah, and what sort of notice period is required. You would normally inform your owner or property manager that something's wrong, it needs to be fixed. What then constitutes the right for the tenant to go, I'll get that sorted through the bonds rather than, going through the right channels and doing it the right way. So, again, there are a few area of concern here, but again, the principle of it, I'm not opposed to it.
Next one, making changes to the property. Now, this is an interesting one that has been coming for a while. And look, I think the vast majority of our clients are very reasonable when it comes to changes that are requested. And the trouble doesn't so much lie in what is getting done. Often the trouble lies in how it's getting done and how it's left after the tenant moves out. So I presume they'll be requiring things to be done professionally. Basically, they're allowing tenants to make a whole raft of changes to the property without permission. So that could be worrying for some owners.
I think if this is to be implemented and brought in, then I think the bond that's taken from the tenant surely has to be a little bit more than 4 weeks, in my opinion. Because if they do...
Well, they are proposing a modification bond as one of the solutions to that.
That's good.
So that was one of my initial thoughts, that surely we can't be keeping the same level of bond. But it would be crazy to go with this without that modification bond. So it's not clear whether it would be included or not. But it's one of the ideas alongside it. So, yeah, I'm glad you were quick to jump on that one.
Oh, definitely.
Because, yes, it only adds to the landlord's risk of recovery then if we've got to, get other things rectified on top of the normal tenancy stuff that may or may not be done when tenant leaves. So, but it might allow the landlord to deny a request for minor changes, but only if the certain circumstances exist or they have a court order. So might make a few owners feel uncertain if such things as painting or installing picture hooks is possible without approval. But ultimately, if the tenant does rectify it and it's all done to a professional standard, and if we've got extra bond to cover it, then, it's workable, in my opinion.
I think it's workable too. I think the one concern I heard from one of my clients a little while ago who talked about, where should I put picture hooks up for tenants? And his idea and mine was that if you pick the right spots where people are not going to put a TV, where they're going to put a clock, where they're going to put a family portrait, do it right, do it once, leave it there. Because what happens is if a tenant goes in and punches a few holes in the wall, they patch it up, paint it, looks good. Next tenant comes in, punches a few more holes, patches it up, looks good. After a few tenant turnovers on that wall, there might be quite a few holes, that have just been puttied up. And, you do have a lot more holes in that wall, and the structural integrity of the wall can, be compromised if there's that much there. Now, obviously that takes years and years and years of drilling, but that was a concern because for some landlords, they do want their properties rented for long term. They're thinking 20, 30 years plus. So
maybe that's a modification people can make if they are then aware that every tenant's going to have the choice regardless of their approval. Maybe make it easy for them. And maybe owners could look to do that now, regardless of the law or not. So, good one. Now, this next one is tied into our previous discussions around ending tenancy agreements, and it's should a no grounds termination by landlords be removed from the Residential Tenancy Act? And this is directly related to what grounds a termination to the lease can be given. And basically, it's looking at needing when a tenant is on a periodic tenancy, you'd only be able to end that periodic tenancy for certain reasons, such as moving back in or sale of a property or wanting to renovate the property. So potentially, again, you wouldn't have that softer exit to things possible, Jewayne.
Yeah. I mean, we could recap what we said before, but
I guess one of the things they're looking at here is maybe changing the notice periods. So at the moment, on a periodic tenancy, a tenant can give 21 days notice to the landlord to end the tenancy, and a landlord needs to give the tenant 60 days notice to end the tenancy. And if the property is sold, they can give 30 days notice. I was hoping that they might make the notice periods the same for tenant and landlord. Heaven forbid.
That would be fair, wouldn't it?
Yes. So wouldn't that be amazing if I'd be up for a 60-day notice period to end tenancy if it went both ways. So I just think there could be a bit more fairness in how they're going about this if they are going to make it only for certain reasons. So wait and see on that one, hey?
Sure will.
Next one was this one was getting a little bit more into the complexities, but they're basically proposing if there's a periodic tenancy and the property is sold, if an investor bought the property, is there any grounds then for the investor to end that tenancy and place a new tenant? And so the same thing comes up again, that if that current tenant wasn't paying market rate, they couldn't just move the tenant on potentially. And if they're not keeping the property as well as they like, they may not be able to just as easily move them on either. So in that case, the value of the property would be more greatly affected by the quality of the tenancy. So that's why having a really good tenant can add a lot of value, especially if you end up selling the property to another investor and you don't want to be paying for it and costing you money if that tenancy isn't up to scratch. So,
well, yeah, 100%. I mean, imagine in a scenario where that tenancy doesn't have a property condition report, doesn't have an application form, and these tenants aren't that great on paying their rent on time. Not terrible to the point where you can actually pick them out,
breach or terminate them necessarily. But
that's right. And
that was a good point about the documentation too, because a lot of investors, when they're buying, don't even look into this. They just go to collect the file on settlement day and think, oh, yeah, of course it's got a tenancy. Of course it's got a property report. Of course inspections have been done, but little do they know that they're about to be in for a surprise. So under that situation, they wouldn't necessarily have grounds to end that tenancy.
Yeah, and I think the ending isn't sometimes necessarily for the fact that the tenants have been good or bad, but it's almost like some of these properties, they do need that fresh start. They do want to do things right from the beginning and not pick up someone else's headache and mess and carry that through for the next 5 years, increasing the risk for that investor. So, yeah, I think I'd hope this doesn't come about, but we'll see how we go.
Another part to this, which would have a lot of impact on what I do on the sales side, is that they're proposing that we may need to give 60 days notice if sold instead of 30 days notice. So at the moment, I give tenants 6 or 7 weeks notice because that's the normal settlement period, and I'd allow a few days on the backside to have them vacate, and I give them more notice if possible. But if the minimum period when we've got a tenant in the property is 60 days on periodic tenancy, then it's going to push our settlement dates out. So we'd have to then settle in sort of a minimum of 9 weeks versus a minimum of 6 weeks. And while that might not sound like a big difference, it's just extra time that a buyer would need to wait potentially, and extra time that a seller will have to wait for their money, a buyer will have to wait to purchase the property. It just adds time, and we should be making things, I think, simpler to transact if we can. I understand where they're coming from, that especially in this market, for tenants at the moment, if they do have to move out, it can be very hard to find a tenancy, but we need the legislation to stand regardless of kind of all markets, and 6 or 7 weeks is still, a decent notice period, and maybe they could set it at 42 days for 6 weeks to be in line with the normal settlement period instead of 60 days. But I guess semantics to some, but we'll have a practical difference when we come to doing a sale. So termination of a fixed term agreement, and what is involved? What's this one?
Sorry, termination of a fixed term agreement by a tenant, right?
Yes. So I guess what's involved in this one, Jewayne?
What's involved in this one? Well, really the question is, should a tenant be allowed to terminate a fixed term tenancy agreement? And
it was basically giving them more outs along the way without potentially having as many consequences.
I think when I first read this one, I was like, this can't. You can't be allowed.
So
to do that.
Some of the things they were talking about. I think
some of the clauses they mentioned. Yeah, sorry, you go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, they were talking about capping break lease fees to the tenant, and potentially having a no break lease fee payable in certain circumstances. And I found this to be pretty difficult to swallow, basically, because if an owner has to pay costs and very real costs in order to, replace that tenant on a contract that they've signed, then why shouldn't the owner be able to pass on as much as possible of that cost? And why shouldn't that be payable by the tenant? So imagine if they came and capped a break lease fee at a small amount, and then the owner ends up bearing, more of the cost than they should. So that's one of the possibilities that could happen.
Yeah, I was thinking this through. It just depends on where they can, come to an agreement of what that break lease fee is. Because if it's a reasonable amount, a couple of weeks worth of rent gives us ample opportunity to replace a tenant.
If it's simplified it perhaps and said, 2 weeks rent is the whole, no, I don't think I'd ever simplify it. What am I saying?
But if that was the case, that's absolutely plausible, and I'd be happy with that. And I think one or two of the other things they've mentioned about allowing a tenant to terminate fixed term lease without penalty were things like, being offered a place in social housing, or being offered a place in aged care facilities where these guys are actually probably never going to necessarily need to rent
the normal tenant
property again.
Yeah.
So in those scenarios, I can kind of see why it would make sense. And we're talking probably not even 1% of all the people that break lease when we look at that. So those two groups, right? So that's okay to me. But I think it comes down to what that fee is. If that break lease fee is, set at $300, it's not really worth it for a lot of landlords when, average rents in Perth are $450 at the moment. So it's not even a week's worth of rent.
Yeah. I'd hate for them to set a fixed amount, and then because they'll probably only review it every 5 or 10 years too. I hate to be skeptical. So let's go on with some of the other ones. We've got, I'll skip over the next one about abandoned goods. That could just help, I think, potentially speed up the disposal of goods, and could be a slight positive to owners if they've got some more options available for disposal, providing it's still lawful. So that wasn't kind of here nor there for me. Making a claim on the bond, they were looking at how to potentially speed up the bond release process. So this could be good if it's handled well. It would basically allow either the landlord or that tenant to apply for disposal of the bond and then have a period, what sort of period would the other party need to agree by or respond by. And it was basically starting to open the door as well for the commissioner to settle bond disputes potentially instead of the court. So they might be looking to have a big shake-up on whether or not we're taking these kind of disputes to court or not, Jewayne, was what I was reading into there. And if it's all handled well, then great. But if, again, it comes down to specifics of how the process then is and whether it's done well. So could go either way.
4 to 6 weeks sometimes for a court date. It's a fairly long time to wait for a couple $1,000 dispute that, the investors need the money, the tenants need the money to move on. Just to be sat in front of a court 6 weeks is a bit long. So if they can speed that process up, changing that system.
So look, the next one, which ties into that, was the resolving of disputes. So they're throwing around different ideas, again, not of having the commissioner involved instead of the courts, potentially then having the state administrative tribunal instead of the magistrates court once it did go to court, having a dispute resolution kind of process to follow instead of the magistrates court as well. So
you missed the first option there, mate, which was offer mediation.
Yeah, mediation. That's what I was circling back around to. So yeah, before you got to any of those things, look, I think they've been whetting their appetite for mediation because they had a mediation process involved during the times of COVID, which basically took pressure off of the courts and gave a third-party mediator, someone there to help massage things and resolve things through when both parties can't get on the same page. So potentially, I think, as you said, it could be good for freeing the courts up and getting resolutions quicker, but it also depends, how they go about it and whether they have the correct resources to deliver on it in a timely fashion as well. So they managed to give one slide to covering some potential benefits to the landlords. Hold on, guys. We've got something for you here. So they're asking the question, is the Residential Tenancy Act balanced between the tenant and the landlord rights and responsibilities? And I think the short answer to that is no. But here's some ideas that they've got to maybe move things the other way. So they're looking at potentially making it an offence under the Residential Tenancy Act if someone willfully damages a property. Now, I thought this was a bloody good one. What can happen often when a tenancy goes bad, and thankfully we'd only ever have very rare instances of this, might have one instance in a year from 800 tenancies we manage. And what can happen is, a relationship can go south, a whole bunch of things can change in someone's world. Who knows what's going on? But it's always, for us, it's a case of a lot of things from left field. Good tenant goes bad, and they decide to take it out on the property one way or another. And it's willful. It's not accidental. It's we're going and punching holes in doors and, we're going to leave things as messed up as we can. And it might even just be small instances of this. At the moment, we can take them we can, keep their bond, we can claim on insurance. So we've got protections there. We can take them to court, we can get a court order. But it's really still only like a civil thing. It's a court order for money that is owable, and we've got other options then for debt collection, and we can lodge them on the National Tenancies database, and there's other things that we can do. So let's not get too down on all this. This would be an extra layer added on to add an offence, the damage of property, and to make it more accessible under the Residential Tenancies Act, from what I gather. So what are your thoughts on that one, Jewayne? I think it can only be a good one.
Yeah, I like it. I don't think anyone should be able to get away with trashing other people's places, and regardless of scenario, I think I really like this. And I think that, it should be something that's brought in. And if it is an offence, is there a fine,
that would be,
as part of that?
That would be the next question, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And what's that fine look like? And I think I think it's a good one. I really do. And there are already some things in the Residential Tenancy Act which do put fines on the landlords and tenants, which we won't get into today. But, I
it's
think
mainly on the landlords and
mainly.
or property manager. So
it is, but I think this is a really good one to just hold tenants to account. I just don't like seeing someone's property trashed just because someone's had a bad day and then they walk away and disappear. Not that we ever see that often, but when clients come to me with properties that have had that happen to them, I really do feel sorry for them. And literally, those guys have disappeared. You don't know where they've gone. You can't track them down. No way to get that money back for the client.
At least they'll have
insurances methods.
It'd be great if that offence, and I'm just reading into things here, but it'd be great if that was, a criminal offence that would, be on their record, and when they're applying for jobs, do they have a criminal record? Explain this willful damage that you've made to, property. So people might think twice about that if that's the impact. So that could be a really good one. Let's move on to the next one. I'm so excited talking about these rebalancing of the RTA. This next one I'm very excited about, which would be if a tenant's repeatedly late in rent, providing options to the landlord for presumably ending the tenancy or some other, I'd love it if imagine if we were able to charge a late fee, Jewayne. I don't think that's going to happen,
right.
But that's my brainstorming here. God, late fees go back as far as, late fees on your videos at Blockbuster.
Late fees are everywhere.
Late fees are everywhere, If you don't pay your rates in time, if you don't pay your electricity, you name it, whatever else is owing in your life, if you don't pay your loan interest, our poor landlords and myself, if we don't pay our loans, we've got late fees and interest accruing. So this, I don't think for a second they're going to allow late fees. So talk myself down on that one. But imagine we get the situation, Jewayne, where we've got the repeat offenders that, don't pay their rent consistently all the time. So imagine the owner waiting to get their pay. They've got a loan interest due that week. They might be a little short on funds themselves. They've just might be getting by week to week. They might have had some things go wrong in their worlds with job or COVID or whatever else. And it's really worrying when the tenant isn't paying their rent and we're having to serve them, a breach notice every month, and then they go ahead and catch up and make the payments again, and we're continually having to follow up with them, continuing to have to put effort into chasing this rent, and the poor owners continually worrying about whether they're getting paid. So I would absolutely love it if there was some kind of middle ground where, okay, you've had 2 breaches, maybe 3 breaches for rent owing, here's a 3-month notice to end the tenancy, or something like that, a longer period, but it's not working out for everyone. It hasn't been enough to terminate you on. It hasn't been severe enough at any one time, but, let's go our separate ways. Here's 3 months. Of course, the tenant will probably stop paying rent at that point before they move out. But what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I like that too. I think that's one of those, of course I do. This is one of the things I was alluding to earlier on about no grounds termination. It might seem petty to some, a couple of days late here and there, but that impact can be quite dramatic on, an investor who might need that money on that day, as you alluded to earlier as well. So, I think that there needs to be some balancing of it. You can't keep giving tenants more and more rights. And I think at the moment, the way the RTA reads, or the way I read it anyway, the tenants do have a lot of rights and do have that sort of balance of power. And moving forward, even so, I think we're going to see a lot more consumer protection creeping into the Residential Tenancies Act. When was it RTA written, Jared? Like 30 years ago, right? So
1987, I believe, originally.
Yeah, so that's right. So there has to be some, changes to the legislation to keep up with the changes in our society. But I also think that, consumer protection is going a bit nuts, and it's sort of creeping into our jobs day to day now with tenants and owners.
The other one they mentioned here was also allowing options if the tenant has received repeated breaches. That could be other things like not keeping the property up to scratch and, you keep having to issue them a breach, and they fix it up at the end of 14 days. And then the next time you're out there in 4 months' time, they've let the place go completely again, and you're continually having to breach them for that. And, I think that if they're going to put such a thing on breaching for non-payment of rent, I think the same should exist for repeated breaches, for other things, and just at least make the same thing consistent and simple, that if you have 3 strikes, for instance, you're out if the landlord decided to exercise that. So,
yep.
Well, they better bring some fairness to things with all the other proposed changes in favour of the tenant. But wait and see, hey?
Yeah, definitely. I'm on the edge of my seat on this one. I know not many people maybe, yes. But I certainly am, because I think it makes a big impact to investors and myself as an investor. If there's more to comply with, but I don't get any more from it either, it sort of does put a question mark in my mind. But, if they're able to square off that ledger by adding some of those protections we've just discussed in for the landlord as well, just to balance out and make sure this is a fair arrangement, then I'm all for it.
And look, the overall impact of all these proposed changes is that it is going to make it harder for someone to self-manage their property. I don't think it should by no means be a reason for someone not to invest in property. We've got to think big picture on why we're investing in property. We're trying to create wealth. If we've got a few extra little things to comply with along the way, then in the grand scheme of things, you do that for the bigger picture, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. And you've just got to focus on that bigger picture. That I completely agree with.
And it does give a greater need for a professional property manager that's all over these things. And one of the things we've always done well in the past with any changes of legislation, especially during COVID times, we're just very quick to get onto things and make sure that all of our clients are doing the right thing and not exposing themselves to risk when legislation's already passed. So we'll be all over it when and if it does come through, and we'll keep you updated on what actually makes it through to the legislation. But on a final note, if you're still listening and you've made it this far, it would be really great if you could go and have your say on these proposed changes, because it's not too late for the department to hear what landlords think. I've already completed, REWA's got a survey at the moment. It takes about 10 minutes or so. They say 20 minutes, but it's a 10-minute survey. And I'll put the link in the show notes, and that would be a great chance for you to go and have your voice heard and for this to be passed on to the legislators now, because the department originally, I believe, drafted some of these proposals in 2020. But then we had COVID hit, and they were all tied up with the COVID legislation and the other things. Now they've got it back on the agenda. It's that the department is no longer has it open for public comment, but it's being debated in Parliament from what I understand, and it's been going around and around in there from what I hear, with some really hot debate. And that's why REWA is trying to get as much feedback as possible to pass on to Parliament at the moment, and show people in Parliament what are some of the potential impacts and how people actually feel about these changes. So that's why, even though it was a bit of a dry episode, Jewayne, I thought it was important, yes, because if we're going to have our say, the time is now. Otherwise, it's going to be too late.
Yeah, once it's law, it's very hard to change.
Good one. So thanks for joining me today, mate.
Thanks for having me again, mate. It's nice chatting with you.
And we'll catch up again on an episode coming up soon too.
Awesome.
See ya.